The candle in Alara's small room had burned down to nothing, yet she did not reach for another. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed with her hands shaking, staring at the letter that had just been pushed under her door. It was not signed, but she knew the handwriting. It was Margaret's, her stepmother, and the words on the page were sharp enough to cut skin. "You will serve at the wedding tomorrow, and you will remember your place," it said. Nothing more, nothing less. Alara pressed the paper flat against her knee and breathed slowly. She had learned, over the 6 years since her father died, that panic solved nothing. What solved things was patience, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to let cruelty win completely. She rose, walked to the small chest at the foot of her bed, and lifted the lid. Inside there was almost nothing of value. A few worn dresses, a pair of shoes with thinning soles, and beneath them, wrapped in a strip of faded cloth, a silver locket. She unwrapped it carefully, the way she always did, as though it might crumble if she was not gentle. The locket was old, its surface scratched from years of being touched, but the engraving on the back was still visible if she tilted it toward the moonlight. 2 initials intertwined, and beneath them, a single word in delicate script, "Always." She had never known who had engraved it. Her mother had died when Alara was only 4 years old, and the locket was the only thing left behind that had not been sold, pawned, or taken by Margaret in the years since. Margaret had tried to take it once, back when Alara was 12. She remembered the moment clearly, how Margaret's fingers had closed around the chain and pulled, how the clasp had dug into the back of Alara's neck before finally breaking free in her stepmother's hand. Alara had cried for it, begged for it, and in the end, Margaret had thrown it back at her with a look of disgust, saying it was worthless tin and not worth the trouble of keeping. Alara had never forgotten that look. She had also never let the locket leave her skin again, not once, not even while she scrubbed floors or carried water from the well behind the kitchen. The estate had once belonged to her father, a modest but respected landowner named Edmund Grant, who had married Margaret 2 years after Alara's mother died. Edmund had believed, in his grief, that his daughter needed a mother figure, and Margaret had seemed kind enough during their courtship. It was only after the wedding that her true nature revealed itself, slowly, like frost creeping across a window. By the time Edmund passed away from a sudden illness, Margaret had already positioned herself, and her own daughter, Marisol, as the rightful mistresses of the household, leaving Alara with barely more status than a servant. The morning after the letter arrived, Alara woke before dawn, as she always did. The house was cold, the fires not yet lit, and she moved through the halls quietly, so as not to wake anyone before her chores were finished. She fed the small fire in the kitchen, kneaded dough for the morning bread, and carried water up 2 flights of stairs so that Marisol could bathe in comfort. Marisol never thanked her. She rarely even looked at her, except to complain that the water was too cool or the towels not soft enough. By mid-morning, the household was in an uproar of excitement. Marisol stood in the center of the drawing room, turning slowly in a gown of pale blue silk, while a seamstress pinned the hem. Margaret stood nearby, arms crossed, examining every detail with a critical eye. "The stitching along the sleeve is uneven," Margaret said, and the seamstress apologized quickly, kneeling to fix it. Marisol admired herself in the tall mirror, tilting her chin up as though she were already a duchess. "This is the most important night of my life," Marisol announced to no one in particular. "The Whitmore family will remember me forever after tonight." Alara, who had been carrying a tray of tea into the room, said nothing. She set the tray down carefully on the side table and turned to leave, but Margaret's voice stopped her. "Alara," she said, without even turning around, "you will attend tonight as well, since we cannot very well leave you here alone to wander the house while we are gone. You will serve drinks among the guests and make yourself useful. Do not embarrass this family." Alara felt heat rise in her chest, but she kept her face calm. "Yes, Margaret," she said quietly. "And wear something appropriate," Margaret added, finally glancing at her with a thin smile. "I believe there is an old dress of Marisol's in the storage room. It should be more than good enough for someone in your position." Marisol laughed, a light, careless sound that stung more than any insult could have. "That old gray one," she said, "the one with the tear in the sleeve. Yes, that would suit her perfectly." Alara did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing only made things worse. that Margaret enjoyed nothing more than watching her daughter's cruelty land, especially when Alara tried to defend herself. So she simply nodded and left the room and went to find the old dress. The storage room was in the back of the house, dim and smelling of dust and old wood. Alara pushed past trunks and broken furniture until she found the dress folded at the bottom of a chest. It was gray, faded almost to the color of ash, with a small tear along the left sleeve that had never been properly mended. She held it up to the light from the small window and studied it. It was not elegant. It was not even fully clean. But it was what she had, and she was determined not to let it break her spirit. That evening, as the carriages were being prepared, Alara dressed alone in her small room. She pulled the gray dress over her head, smoothing the fabric as best she could, and looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror on the wall. The dress hung loosely on her frame, the tear in the sleeve exposing a strip of skin at her elbow. She looked, she knew, exactly like what Margaret wanted her to look like. A servant, a nobody, someone to be overlooked. But then her eyes moved to her throat, where the silver locket rested against her collarbone. She reached up and touched it gently, feeling the familiar shape of the engraving beneath her fingers, even though she could not see it in the low light. "Whatever happens tonight," she whispered to herself, "I know who I am." She thought of her father then, of the way he used to call her his brave girl, of the way he had held her hand at her mother's funeral, and promised that things would be all right, even though his voice had trembled as he said it. She thought of her mother, whose face she barely remembered, whose voice she could not recall at all, but whose locket had somehow survived every attempt to take it from her. She did not know why the locket meant so much to her. She only knew that it did, that it felt like the last thread connecting her to a life before all of this, before the cold mornings and the endless chores and the quiet cruelty that had become the rhythm of her days. Downstairs, she could hear Marisol's excited chatter as she climbed into the carriage, could hear Margaret instructing the driver on the fastest route to the Whitmore estate. Alara waited until the sound of wheels on gravel had faded before stepping out of her room. She was to travel separately, in the smaller carriage reserved for staff, arriving slightly behind the family, so as not to be seen entering alongside them. The ride was long and quiet. Alara sat alone, watching the countryside pass by in the fading evening light, fields turning gold, and then gray, as the sun dipped below the horizon. She thought about the wedding ahead of her, about spending an entire evening pouring drinks for people who would not even glance at her twice, about watching Marisol dance and laugh in a beautiful gown, while she stood in the shadows in a torn one. She could have refused to go. She could have claimed illness, could have hidden in her room and let Margaret rage without her, but something in her, some stubborn spark that refused to be extinguished, made her want to attend anyway. She would not let Margaret's cruelty keep her locked away forever. She would walk into that grand hall with her head held high, torn dress or not, and she would remember, every single moment, that the fabric on her back did not define the woman wearing it. As the carriage rounded a final bend, the Whitmore estate came into view, and Alara's breath caught despite herself. The house was enormous, built of pale stone that seemed to glow faintly under the rising moon, with dozens of windows lit from within by warm golden light. Carriages lined the long drive, footmen moving briskly between them, and the faint sound of music drifted out through the open doors. Alara stepped down from the small carriage at the servants' entrance, smoothing her dress one last time, and took a slow breath. The tear in her sleeve felt suddenly very large, very visible, and she fought the urge to cover it with her hand. A young footman glanced at her as she approached, his eyes flicking briefly to the state of her dress before he looked away, his expression carefully blank. "Through this way, miss," he said, gesturing toward a side door that led into the house. Alara followed him through a narrow hallway, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, past a kitchen, bustling with activity, and finally, through a set of doors that opened into the edge of the great hall. The noise hit her first, a wall of music and laughter and conversation, and then the light, dozens of candles and chandeliers, casting everything in a warm golden glow. She stood at the threshold for a moment, taking it all in, the silk gowns and polished shoes, the glittering jewelry and confident smiles. She thought of turning back, just for a moment. It would be so easy to stay near the kitchen, to hide among the staff, and never step into that room at all. But she thought again of her father, of his voice telling her she was brave, and she thought of the locket resting against her skin, and she straightened her shoulders and stepped forward into the light. No one noticed her at first. That was, she told herself, exactly as it should be. She moved along the edge of the room, picking up a tray of drinks from a table set aside for the staff, and began the work she had been sent there to do. She offered drinks to guests who barely glanced at her, murmured polite words that were rarely returned, and tried not to think about how her torn sleeve must look under the bright chandeliers. Across the room, Marisol was already the center of attention, laughing brightly at something a young gentleman had said, her blue silk gown catching the light beautifully with every movement. Margaret stood nearby, watching her daughter with obvious pride, occasionally glancing around the room, as though cataloging every person of importance in attendance. Alara kept her eyes down, kept her steps quiet, and told herself that this evening would pass like any other. She would serve, she would endure, and she would return home before the night was through, unnoticed and unremarked upon, exactly as Margaret intended. She had no way of knowing, as she moved through that glittering crowd with her tray of drinks, that somewhere across the room, an older man with silver hair and a quiet, watchful expression had already turned his head in her direction, his gaze fixed not on her torn dress, but on the small glint of silver at her throat. A glass slipped from Alara's tray and shattered on the marble floor before she even realized her hand had trembled. The sound cracked through a lull in the music like a slap, and for one terrible second, every face nearby turned toward her. Heat rushed up her neck as she dropped to her knees, gathering the broken pieces with quick, careful fingers, praying no one would make a scene of it. Someone did. A young woman in a rose-colored gown let out a light laugh and said, loud enough for those around her to hear, "How clumsy the help is tonight." A ripple of quiet amusement passed through the small circle of guests standing near her, and Alara felt her cheeks burn, though she kept her eyes fixed on the shards of glass in her hands. Marisol, who had drifted close enough to witness the moment, seized on it eagerly. "Oh, that is only my stepsister," she announced to the small gathering, her voice pitched to Carrie. "She is not accustomed to fine company. Do forgive her manners, or rather, her lack of them." Laughter followed, soft and cruel, and Alara rose to her feet with the broken glass cradled carefully, so as not to cut herself, murmuring an apology to no one in particular, before retreating toward the servants' table to dispose of it. Her hands were steady, even though her chest felt tight. She had endured worse than laughter. She reminded herself of that fact as she wiped down the tray and picked up fresh glasses, and she reminded herself again a few minutes later, when Marisol swept past her on the arm of a young gentleman, deliberately letting her elbow brush Alara's tray hard enough to nearly topple it a second time. Alara caught the tray before it fell, her arm aching from the sudden strain, and said nothing. Marisol did not even look back. The evening rolled on in that fashion, small humiliations stacked one atop another, each one small enough that Alara could not protest without appearing foolish, yet large enough that by the time the orchestra paused for the formal announcements, she felt as though she were carrying an invisible weight across her shoulders. She kept moving anyway, kept her tray steady and her expression composed, because stopping, she knew, would only give Margaret satisfaction. It was during the pause in the music, as the great doors at the far end of the hall opened to admit a fresh wave of guests, that the room's attention shifted entirely. A tall man entered, dressed in dark formal clothing that carried none of the ornamentation favored by the younger guests, yet somehow commanded more attention than any of them. His hair was silver at the temples, his face lined but composed, and his eyes moved across the crowded hall with the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades being watched and measured by everyone around him. "That is the Duke," someone near Alara whispered to a companion. "Alden Whitmore, father of the groom. They say he rarely attends these gatherings anymore, not since his wife passed." Alara had heard the name before, of course. Everyone in the region had, but she had never seen the man himself. She watched him move through the crowd with the same detached curiosity she might have applied to any stranger, noting the way guests bowed and murmured greetings as he passed, the way he answered each with brief, polite words, before continuing on, his gaze never quite settling anywhere for long. She turned back to her tray, refilling glasses for a cluster of guests near the wall, and thought nothing more of him. She had her own evening to survive, her own careful path to walk between invisibility and disaster, and the Duke's arrival, however significant to the rest of the room, meant little to a girl in a torn gray dress, standing at the edges of it all. She did not notice, at first, that his gaze had found her. It happened slowly, the way such things often do. Alden Whitmore had greeted his son's future in-laws, exchanged brief courtesies with a handful of old acquaintances, and allowed his attention to drift across the crowded hall the way it always did at these gatherings, cataloging faces out of long habit rather than genuine interest. He had learned, over the years, to keep his expression pleasant and unreadable no matter what memories the evening stirred, and weddings, he had found, stirred a great many memories he preferred to keep buried. It was the flash of silver that caught him first. A small glint at the collar of a young woman near the refreshment table, barely visible beneath the collar of a worn gray dress. There, and gone again, as she turned to pour a drink for a guest. He told himself it meant nothing. Silver jewelry was common enough, and grief had a way of making a man see ghosts in ordinary things. He looked away, resumed his conversation with a nearby gentleman about matters of little consequence, and told himself the matter was closed. But his eyes returned to her a moment later, almost against his will, and this time she had turned enough that he caught a clearer glimpse of the locket resting against her collarbone. Something in his chest tightened, an old and familiar ache he had spent 25 years trying to bury, beneath duty and silence. It could not be, he told himself. It was a common shape, an ordinary trinket, nothing more. And yet he found himself watching her for the rest of the conversation, only half listening to the words being spoken around him, his mind drifting backward through decades to a woman he had loved once, long before his father had forbidden the match, long before duty had forced him into a marriage of convenience, with a woman he respected but never loved in the way he had loved her. Isabel. Her name rose in his mind unbidden, sharp and painful even after all these years, and with it came the memory of the very locket he thought he was looking at now, the one he had commissioned himself from a jeweler in the capital, the one he had placed around her neck the night before his father sent men to escort her from the county forever. He had never seen her again after that night. He had heard, years later, second-hand and unconfirmed, that she had married a modest landowner somewhere to the west, and had died not long after. He had grieved her in private, in the only way a man bound by duty was permitted to grieve, and he had told himself, in the decades since, that whatever remained of her in the world had long since scattered into memory and dust. But the locket, the shape of it, the way it caught the candlelight, the particular curve of its clasp, all of it matched a memory he had carried for 25 years without ever expecting to see confirmed again. He excused himself from the conversation with a murmured apology and began to move through the crowd, his steps unhurried but purposeful, his eyes fixed on the young woman in the gray dress, who had no idea, yet, that her entire world was about to be turned inside out by a piece of silver she had worn every day of her life, without ever understanding its true weight. Elara felt the shift in the room before she understood its cause. Conversations near her seemed to quiet slightly, and she looked up from her tray, to find the Duke himself standing only a few paces away, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her instinctively step back, her grip tightening on the tray in her hands. "Your Grace," she said quickly, dropping into a small, awkward curtsy, unsure of the correct protocol and terrified of making a mistake in front of a man of his standing. "Forgive me. I did not mean to draw your attention." He did not answer right away. He simply studied her, his eyes moving from her face down to her throat and back again, and Elara felt a strange discomfort settle over her, as though she had done something wrong without knowing what it was. "Your name," he said finally, his voice quieter and more careful than she expected. "What is your name, child?" "Elara, Your Grace," she answered, her voice small. "Elara Grant." Something crossed his face at the sound of her name, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps confusion, though he said nothing further about it. Instead, his gaze dropped once more to the locket at her collar, and he took a small step closer, close enough that Elara felt the urge to retreat again, though something in his expression, some quiet desperation beneath the composed exterior, made her hold her ground instead. "That locket," he said slowly. "May I ask where you received it?" Elara's hand rose instinctively to cover it, an old habit born of years spent protecting the one thing Margaret had never managed to take from her. "It was my mother's, Your Grace," she said carefully. "It is all I have left of her." The Duke's breath seemed to catch, and for a moment, The noise of the ballroom around them, the music and laughter and clinking glasses, seemed to fade into a distant hum. He opened his mouth as though to ask another question, but before he could speak, a sharp voice cut across the space between them. "Your Grace," Margaret said, appearing suddenly at Alara's side with a bright, practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. "I do apologize if my stepdaughter has been troublesome. She is only staff for the evening, and I am certain she has duties elsewhere that require her attention." She reached for Alara's arm, her fingers closing around it with a grip far tighter than necessary, and began to steer her away from the Duke without waiting for a response. Alara stumbled slightly, caught off guard, the tray in her free hand tilting dangerously before she managed to steady it. "Wait," the Duke said, and there was something in his voice, some note of authority that made even Margaret pause. "I would like to speak with her further, if you do not object." Margaret's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before recovering fully. "Of course, Your Grace," she said smoothly, though her grip on Alara's arm did not loosen. "Whatever you wish." Alara stood frozen between them, the tray still balanced awkwardly in her hands, her heart pounding with a confusion she could not name. She did not understand why a duke would take interest in her, why the sight of her mother's locket had brought such a strange, haunted look to his face, or why Margaret's fingers were digging into her arm, with a force that suggested fear, rather than mere irritation. All she knew, standing there beneath the golden light of 100 candles, was that something enormous had shifted in the room, something she did not yet have the words to describe, and that the small silver locket she had guarded so fiercely for so many years was, for the first time in her life, no longer just a memory of her mother. It was, somehow, a key to a door she had never known existed. Margaret did not release her grip easily, but the Duke's quiet request had carried enough weight that even she could not refuse it outright, without appearing rude in front of the assembled guests, many of whom had begun to notice the small drama unfolding near the refreshment table. She forced her smile wider and inclined her head. "Of course, Your Grace," she repeated, though this time she added, "though I must say, she is a simple girl, not accustomed to conversation with someone of your standing. I would hate for her to waste your valuable time." "I will be the judge of how my time is spent," the Duke replied, his tone even but firm enough that Margaret's smile tightened at the edges. "If you would excuse us." Margaret had no choice but to step back, though her eyes lingered on Alara with a warning sharp enough to cut, a silent promise that this conversation would not be forgotten or forgiven later. She retreated only a few steps, hovering at the edge of hearing distance, close enough to watch, but not close enough to be accused of eavesdropping outright. The Duke gestured toward a quieter corner of the hall, near a tall window that looked out over the estate gardens, and Alara followed him, with her tray still balanced awkwardly in her hands, unsure what else to do with it. He seemed to notice her discomfort and gently took the tray from her, setting it on a nearby table without comment, freeing her hands and, in some small way, easing the tension in her shoulders. "I did not mean to frighten you," he said once they had reached the quieter corner, his voice softer now that they were removed from the crowd. "I only wish to ask you a few questions, if you would permit me." Alara nodded, though her heart still raced. "Of course, Your Grace," she said, "though I do not know what I could possibly tell you that would interest a man such as yourself." He studied her for a long moment before answering, his eyes tracing her features with an intensity that made her feel, oddly, as though he were searching for something specific, something he expected to find but was afraid he might not. "Your mother," he said finally. "You mentioned the locket belonged to her. Can you tell me her name?" "Isabel," Alara said softly. "Isabel Grant, though I believe that was her married name. I do not know what she was called before she married my father." The Duke's composure slipped, just slightly, at the sound of the name, and Alara saw his jaw tighten, his eyes glancing briefly toward the window, as though gathering himself before he spoke again. "And do you know where she came from, before your father?" he asked. "Do you know anything of her life before she married?" Alara shook her head slowly. "I was very young when she died, Your Grace. Only 4 years old. My father spoke of her sometimes, but he never told me much of her past, only that she had come to our county as a young woman, and that he had loved her from the moment he saw her. He said she carried a great sadness with her always, though he never understood its cause, and that she asked him once, before they married, never to press her about the years before they met. The Duke closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, Alara saw something in his expression that she could only describe as grief, old and deep and carefully contained, the kind of sorrow that had been folded away for so long it had nearly forgotten how to surface. "I see," he said quietly. "Your Grace," Alara said, hesitant but unable to stop herself. "Forgive my forwardness, but you seem troubled by this. Did you know my mother?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the breast pocket of his formal coat and withdrew a small folded portrait, worn soft at the edges from years of handling, and held it out to her without a word. Alara took it carefully and unfolded it, and her breath caught in her throat. The woman in the portrait was young, perhaps 18 or 19, with dark hair pinned loosely away from her face and eyes that seemed to hold both warmth and sorrow in equal measure. Alara had no memory of her mother's face, not really, only vague impressions carried forward from early childhood, a soft voice, the smell of lavender, the feeling of being held. But something in the shape of the woman's features, the particular tilt of her chin, the curve of her mouth, struck a chord of recognition so deep it made Alara's hands tremble. "I believe," the Duke said carefully, watching her reaction, "that this may be a portrait of your mother, taken many years before she came to your father's county. I commissioned it myself, when she and I were young." Alara looked up at him sharply. "You knew her," she said, "before my father." "I loved her," the Duke said simply, the words carrying the weight of decades of silence finally broken. "Before duty and my father's demands tore us apart. I loved her more than I have ever loved anyone since, and I have spent 25 years believing I would never see any trace of her again in this world." Alara's mind raced, trying to fit these new pieces into a picture she had never imagined existed. Her mother, a woman she barely remembered, had once been loved by a duke, had once lived a life entirely separate from the quiet, modest existence Alara had always assumed defined her. "Why," she asked slowly, "would you have been parted?" "If you loved her as you say." The Duke's expression darkened, old anger surfacing briefly beneath the grief. "My father did not approve," he said. "She came from a family of little standing, and he had already arranged a match for me with a woman of proper birth, one who would strengthen our family's position among the nobility. I fought against it as hard as a young man could fight against his own father, but in the end, he sent men to remove her from the county before I could act, and by the time I learned where she had gone, she had already vanished entirely, taking with her whatever future we might have built together." He paused, his eyes returning to the locket at Alara's throat, and his voice, when he continued, was barely above a whisper. "I gave her that locket the night before she was taken from me," he said. "I had it made specially, engraved with our initials intertwined, and a single word beneath them. I have wondered every day since what became of it, and of her." Ilara's fingers rose slowly to the clasp at the back of her neck, her mind spinning with the implications of what he was suggesting. Implications too large and too strange to fully grasp in the space of a single conversation at a crowded ball. "May I see it?" the Duke asked gently. "Only for a moment. I promise, I mean you no harm." Alara hesitated only briefly, before nodding, her fingers working the small clasp with practiced ease, born of years spent removing and replacing it in private. She lifted the chain over her head and held the locket out to him, watching his face carefully as his fingers closed around it, watching the way his hand trembled as he turned it over to examine the engraving on the back. His breath left him in a shaking exhale as he read the initials, the same 2 letters he had carved there himself a quarter-century earlier, followed by the single word he had chosen with such care. "Always," he read aloud, his voice cracking slightly on the word. "This is the locket. I would know it anywhere. I made it with my own hands, guided the jeweler through every detail myself." He looked up at Alara then, his eyes bright with an emotion she could not name, something between hope and disbelief, and a grief so old it had calcified into something almost unrecognizable. "If this is truly the locket I gave to Isabel," he said slowly, choosing his words with obvious care, "and if you are her daughter, born after she disappeared from my life, then I must ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, no matter how strange the question may seem." Alara nodded, though her heart was pounding so hard she feared he might hear it. "Ask me anything, Your Grace," she said. "How old are you, Alara?" he asked quietly. Precisely how old? I will turn 24 this coming winter, she said. The Duke's face went pale, and he seemed, for a moment, to sway slightly on his feet, one hand reaching out to steady himself against the window frame beside them. 24 years, he murmured, more to himself than to her. That would place your birth almost exactly 9 months after she was taken from me. Alara stared at him, the full weight of his meaning settling slowly over her like cold water. Your Grace, she said carefully, are you suggesting? I am suggesting, he said, his voice trembling now with an emotion he could no longer contain, that you may be my daughter, Alara. The child I never knew existed. The child Isabel must have carried away with her when my father tore us apart, and never told a living soul, for fear of what my father's family might have done to protect their arranged match, had they known the truth. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and enormous, and behind them, unnoticed by either, Margaret had crept close enough to hear every syllable, her face draining of color, as the full danger of the moment crashed over her like a wave. Margaret's mind raced through a dozen desperate calculations in the span of a single heartbeat. If the Duke's suspicions proved true, if Alara truly carried noble blood through a connection to one of the most powerful families in the region, then everything Margaret had built over the past 6 years, every carefully constructed lie about inheritance and ownership, every document she had quietly altered in her favor after Edmund's death, stood at risk of collapsing entirely. She stepped forward before she could stop herself, inserting her voice into a conversation she had no right to interrupt. Your Grace, she said, her tone sharper than she intended. Forgive me, but I must express some concern. Alara has always been a fanciful girl, prone to exaggeration. I would hate for her imagination to cause you unnecessary distress on such an important evening. The Duke turned toward her slowly, his expression cooling into something far more guarded than the raw emotion he had shown moments before. I do not believe imagination explains a locket I commissioned with my own hands 25 years ago, he said evenly. Nor does it explain a portrait of a woman I loved, whose face I would recognize in an instant, echoed so clearly in the features of the young woman standing before me. Margaret's composure cracked further, though she fought to maintain it. Surely there are other explanations, she pressed. Coincidences happen. Lockets can be sold, traded, passed between many hands over the years. It proves nothing definitively. Then we shall find proof, the Duke said, his voice carrying a note of quiet finality that silenced her protests entirely. I have resources at my disposal that most families could never hope to match. Letters, records, witnesses who knew Isabel in her youth. If Alara is indeed my daughter, I intend to discover the truth, regardless of how inconvenient that truth might prove for anyone in this room. By now, several nearby guests had begun to notice the tension radiating from the small corner conversation, their attention drifting away from the orchestra and toward the unfolding drama near the window. Marisol, catching sight of her mother's stricken expression from across the hall, abandoned the young gentleman she had been charming and made her way over quickly, her earlier confidence replaced by wary curiosity. Mother, what is happening? She asked, glancing between Margaret's pale face and the Duke's stern composure. Why does everyone look as though the world has ended? Nothing has happened, Margaret said quickly, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. The Duke is simply mistaken about a small matter concerning Alara's mother. Nothing that concerns us. It concerns rather a great deal, actually, the Duke corrected, and there was steel beneath his measured tone now, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. I have reason to believe that Alara is my daughter, born of a woman I loved, before circumstances forced us apart. I intend to pursue this matter thoroughly, and I would advise anyone with information relevant to Isabel Grant's history to come forward now, rather than allow me to discover their silence later. The words landed among the small gathered crowd like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of shocked whispering spreading outward within seconds. Marisol's mouth fell open, her earlier laughter and confidence entirely forgotten, as she stared first at her mother, then at Alara, as though seeing her stepsister for the first time. That cannot be true, Marisol said, though her voice had lost its earlier sharpness, replaced by something closer to genuine confusion. She is nothing but a servant. She has always been nothing but a servant. Alara, standing quietly at the center of the unfolding chaos, felt strangely calm, despite the enormity of what was happening around her. Perhaps it was shock, Or perhaps it was simply that she had spent so many years absorbing insults and humiliations without protest, that her body no longer knew how to react with panic, even to news this staggering. She looked at the Duke, at the man who had just claimed to be her father, and found herself searching his face for some sign of deception, some hint that this was merely an elaborate cruelty designed to humiliate her further. But she found none. What she found instead was a man whose eyes shone with unshed tears, whose hands trembled slightly as he held her mother's portrait, whose entire bearing had shifted from the composed authority of a duke to something far more vulnerable, far more human. "Your Grace," Alara said quietly, cutting through the rising noise of whispered speculation around them. "If what you say is true, I do not know how to feel about it. My whole life, I believed myself to be nothing more than the daughter of a modest landowner, a girl with no claim to anything beyond what little my father left behind. I do not know how to suddenly become someone else entirely." The Duke's expression softened at her words, and he reached out, hesitating only a moment before gently taking her hand in both of his. "You do not need to become anyone else," he said. "If you are my daughter, then you have always been exactly who you are meant to be. The only thing that changes is that the world will finally see you as such." Margaret, watching this exchange with mounting horror, understood with sudden clarity that the evening had slipped entirely beyond her control. "Your Grace," she tried once more, her voice tight with barely restrained panic. "Surely this is a conversation better suited to private quarters, rather than in the middle of your son's wedding celebration. Think of the scandal, the whispers that will follow if this matter becomes public before the facts are confirmed." For once, the Duke seemed to consider her words, not out of deference to her opinion, but out of genuine concern for Alara's well-being, amid the growing crowd of curious onlookers. "You are correct that this deserves careful handling," he said finally, releasing Alara's hand and straightening to his full height once more. "But do not mistake my discretion for uncertainty. I will send for you tomorrow, Alara, so that we may speak further and begin the process of confirming what I already believe in my heart to be true. In the meantime," he continued, turning a hard look toward Margaret, "I trust that nothing will happen to interfere with that arrangement." "Of course not, Your Grace," Margaret said quickly, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them, her mind already racing ahead to consider what desperate measures might yet salvage her position before the truth could fully unravel the careful lies she had spent years constructing. The orchestra resumed its music moments later, the wedding celebration continuing around them as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, though the whispers had already begun to spread through the hall like wildfire, guest to guest, each retelling growing slightly more elaborate than the last. Alara stood at the edge of it all, the locket now clasped once more around her own neck, feeling as though she had stepped through some invisible threshold into an entirely different life, one she had never imagined possible, one that filled her with a fragile, cautious hope she barely dared to acknowledge. Across the room, Marisol watched her stepsister with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning fear, understanding for the first time that the girl she had spent years humiliating might soon hold more power and standing than she herself would ever possess. And beside her, Margaret's mind churned with increasingly desperate schemes, already calculating how much time remained before the Duke's investigation uncovered truths she had spent years working desperately to bury. The carriage ride home was silent except for the sound of wheels grinding against gravel and Margaret's rapid, uneven breathing. Marisol sat pressed against the far window, glancing occasionally at Alara, with an expression that had not yet settled into anger or fear, still caught somewhere in the disorienting space between the two. Alara herself stared out into the darkness, her fingers resting lightly against the locket at her throat, replaying every word the Duke had spoken, as though testing them for cracks that might reveal the whole thing to be some elaborate misunderstanding. It was only once they arrived back at the estate, once the front door had closed behind them, and the servants had retreated to their quarters for the night, that Margaret finally allowed her composure to shatter completely. "You will not go tomorrow," she said, rounding on Alara the moment they were alone in the entrance hall, her voice low and dangerous, in a way Alara had heard only rarely before. "Whatever the Duke believes he saw tonight, whatever fantasy has taken hold of his grieving mind, you will put an end to it immediately. You will send word that you are unwell, that you cannot attend, and this entire matter will be forgotten within a week." Alara turned to face her stepmother fully, something steady and unfamiliar settling into her chest, a quiet resolve she had not felt in years. "No," she said simply. Margaret's eyes widened at the single word, as though she could not quite believe Alara had spoken it at all. "What did you say to me?" she demanded. "I said no," Alara repeated, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart. "I have spent 6 years doing exactly as you demanded, Margaret. I have scrubbed your floors, and carried your water, and worn your daughter's cast-off clothing, without complaint, because I believed I had no other choice. But last night, a man who may be my father looked at me as though I mattered, as though I was worth something beyond what use I could provide to this household, and I will not throw that away simply because it frightens you." "It should frighten you as well," Margaret snapped, though her voice cracked slightly at the edges. "You know nothing of the world beyond this estate. You know nothing of how quickly noble families can turn against those who threaten their arrangements. If the Duke's family does not want this claim proven true, they will find ways to bury it, and you along with it." Alara felt a flicker of doubt at these words, but she pushed it aside, holding firm to the memory of the Duke's trembling hands, the genuine grief and hope she had seen in his eyes. "Perhaps that is a risk I am willing to take," she said quietly. "I would rather know the truth of who I am, even if it brings danger, than continue living a lie simply because it is safer." Marisol, who had been watching this exchange in silence, finally spoke, her voice smaller than Alara had ever heard it. "Mother," she said hesitantly, "what if it is true? What if she really is the Duke's daughter? What happens to us then?" Margaret's face twisted with something that looked almost like panic, before smoothing back into cold determination. "Nothing happens to us," she said firmly, more to convince herself than her daughter. "This house, this land, everything your father left behind, belongs to this family, regardless of whatever fanciful connection the Duke believes he has discovered. Alara has no legal claim to anything beyond what we choose to give her, locket or no locket, and I intend to remind everyone of that fact quite clearly, should the need arise." She turned back to Alara, her expression hardening once more. "You will attend this meeting tomorrow, since I cannot very well forbid it without drawing further attention to the matter," she said. "But you will remember, when you return, that whatever fantasy the Duke entertains about your parentage changes nothing about your position in this household. You are still under my roof, still dependent on my charity, and you would do well not to forget it." Alara said nothing further, simply turned and walked toward the narrow staircase leading to her small room, feeling Margaret's eyes on her back the entire way, sharp and calculating. She did not sleep well that night, her mind turning over every detail of the ballroom conversation, every flicker of emotion on the Duke's face, every implication of a life she had never imagined for herself. But beneath the uncertainty, something new had taken root, small and fragile but undeniably present: hope. Morning arrived gray and overcast, a light rain tapping against her window, as Alara dressed carefully in the least worn of her few dresses, a simple dark blue garment that had at least been properly mended. She had barely finished fastening the last button when a knock sounded at the front door below, followed by the low murmur of voices and the sound of Margaret's footsteps hurrying to answer it. A carriage bearing the Whitmore family crest had arrived, sent specifically to collect her, and the young footman standing at the door delivered a brief message with careful formality. "His Grace requests the presence of Miss Alara Grant at the Whitmore estate this morning, at her earliest convenience," he said, glancing past Margaret's shoulder as though searching for Alara herself. "I am ready," Alara said, appearing at the top of the stairs before Margaret could offer any excuse or objection. She descended quickly, aware of Margaret's tight expression and Marisol's wide, uncertain eyes watching from the drawing-room doorway, and stepped past them both without a backward glance, climbing into the waiting carriage with a composure she did not entirely feel. The ride to the Whitmore estate felt different in daylight than it had the night before, the grand house losing none of its magnificence, but somehow appearing less intimidating under the soft gray morning light. A servant met her at the front entrance this time, rather than the side door reserved for staff, and led her through halls she had only glimpsed briefly during the wedding celebration, past rooms filled with fine furniture, and portraits of Whitmore ancestors stretching back generations. She was shown into a study lined with tall bookshelves, where the Duke sat waiting behind a heavy wooden desk, an older woman standing quietly beside him, whom Alara did not recognize. The Duke rose immediately upon her entrance, his expression carrying none of the guarded formality she had expected, only quiet warmth, and something that looked remarkably like relief. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing toward a chair positioned across from his desk. "I was not entirely certain you would." "I nearly did not have the choice," Ilara admitted, settling into the offered chair. "My stepmother was not pleased." "I imagine not," the Duke said, a flicker of understanding crossing his features. He gestured toward the older woman standing beside him, whose sharp eyes had been studying Ilara closely since she entered the room. "This is Agnes," he said. "She served as Isabel's companion many years ago, before circumstances separated us. I asked her to come this morning, hoping she might help confirm what I already believed to be true." Agnes stepped forward slowly, her weathered face creasing with an emotion Ilara could not quite identify, something between wonder and grief. She studied Ilara's features for a long moment, her eyes lingering on the shape of her jaw, the color of her eyes, before finally speaking in a voice roughened by age. "Forgive an old woman staring," she said softly, "but you have her eyes, child. Isabel's eyes exactly. I would know them anywhere, even after all these years." Ilara felt something tighten in her throat at these words, a strange mixture of grief for a mother she barely remembered, and cautious wonder at the growing certainty that the story the Duke had told her was, impossibly, entirely true. "You knew my mother well?" she asked quietly. "I knew her better than almost anyone," Agnes said, settling into a nearby chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints had grown stiff with age. "I was there the night she was taken from this house, the night His Grace's father sent men to remove her before dawn, giving her scarcely an hour to gather her belongings and disappear from the county entirely. I remember she was crying and frightened, and she kept one hand pressed against her stomach the entire time, though I did not understand the significance of that gesture until many years later, when I finally allowed myself to wonder whether she might have been carrying a child even then." The room fell quiet for a long moment, the weight of the old woman's words settling over all three of them. Ilara looked down at her own hands, trying to imagine her mother as a young, frightened woman fleeing in the dead of night, carrying a secret so dangerous it had to be hidden even from those who loved her most. "I believe," the Duke said finally, breaking the silence, "that we have more than enough reason to pursue this matter formally. I intend to consult with legal counsel this very week, to review whatever records remain from that time, and to establish, beyond any doubt, whether you are indeed my daughter. I understand this may feel overwhelming, Ilara, and I do not wish to rush you into accepting a truth you have not yet had time to process. But I must tell you honestly that I have waited 25 years for even a fragment of hope that Isabel's memory survived somewhere in this world, and I am not willing to let that hope slip away now without a fight." Ilara met his eyes steadily, feeling the fragile hope inside her chest grow slightly stronger, slightly more solid. "Then let us discover the truth together," she said, "whatever it may cost either of us." By the time Ilara returned home that afternoon, Margaret had already set her own plans into motion. She sat in the drawing room with a man named Mr. Fenwick, a solicitor she had summoned that very morning under the pretense of reviewing minor estate matters, though her true purpose was far more urgent. Marisol hovered near the doorway, listening with growing unease as her mother laid out the situation in low, clipped tones. "If this claim is proven true," Margaret said, pacing before the cold fireplace, "everything changes. The Duke's family carries enormous influence, and if Ilara is recognized as his daughter, she may gain not only his protection, but potentially a share of Edmund's estate that I have spent years consolidating under my own name. I need to know precisely what can be done to prevent that outcome, or at minimum, to delay it long enough for me to secure our position." Mr. Fenwick, a thin man with sharp, calculating eyes, considered the matter carefully before responding. "There are avenues worth exploring," he said. "Records can be difficult to verify after so many years, particularly if certain documents were never properly filed or have since been lost. If there is any question about the authenticity of the birth records, or the timeline of events surrounding Isabel Grant's arrival in this county, such questions can be used to cast doubt on the Duke's claims, regardless of how convinced he personally may be." Margaret's eyes narrowed with interest. "And if certain records could be made to disappear entirely," she asked carefully, "would that not simplify matters considerably?" Mr. Fenwick's expression remained carefully neutral, though something in his posture suggested he understood exactly what she was proposing. Such things carry considerable risk, he said. If discovered, the consequences would be severe, not only for you, but for anyone assisting in such an effort. I would advise a more subtle approach. Cast doubt through testimony, rather than destruction. Question the reliability of witnesses. Suggest that Isabel Grant's history before her marriage to your late husband remains murky enough that any claim of noble parentage should be treated with skepticism. Marisol, who had been listening from the doorway with growing discomfort, finally stepped forward. "Mother," she said hesitantly, "is this truly necessary? If Alara is his daughter, perhaps it would be simpler and kinder to simply allow the truth to be known." Margaret rounded on her daughter sharply. "Kindness has no place in matters of survival, Marisol," she said. "Do you understand what we stand to lose if this claim succeeds? Everything your father built, everything I have maintained since his passing, could be stripped away or divided, leaving us with nothing. I have not spent 6 years managing this household, simply to hand it over to a girl who has done nothing but scrub floors and carry water since the day her father died." Marisol fell silent, though the uncertainty in her expression did not fully fade. She had spent years believing herself entitled to every comfort the household provided, had grown accustomed to viewing Alara as beneath her notice, but something about the events of the previous evening, the raw hope in the Duke's eyes, the quiet dignity with which Alara had faced the sudden upheaval of her entire identity, had planted a small seed of doubt that Margaret's cold calculations could not entirely extinguish. Meanwhile, at the Whitmore estate, the Duke had wasted no time setting his own investigation into motion. He met that same afternoon with his family's longtime legal advisor, a careful and thorough man named Mr. Hartley, laying out everything Agnes had confirmed and everything Alara herself had shared regarding her mother's history. "I want every record searched," the Duke instructed, pacing before his study window with restless energy, quite unlike his usual composed demeanor. "Church registries, county records, anything that might confirm Isabel's movements in the months following her departure from this estate 25 years ago. I want to know precisely when she arrived in Edmund Grant's county, when Alara was born, and whether the timeline aligns with what we already suspect." Mr. Hartley nodded, making careful notes as the Duke spoke. "I will begin immediately, Your Grace," he said. "Though I must caution you that records from that era are not always complete, particularly for a woman traveling under difficult circumstances, potentially seeking to obscure her movements from those who might pursue her." "I am aware of the difficulties," the Duke said, his jaw tightening. "My father ensured, quite deliberately, that Isabel's departure left as little trace as possible, precisely to prevent me from following her. But surely something remains. A church registry noting her marriage to Edmund, a birth record for Alara herself, something that will allow us to build an undeniable case." Mr. Hartley agreed to begin his search immediately, promising to report back within the week with whatever findings he could uncover. As he departed, the Duke remained alone in his study, staring out at the gray afternoon rain, his mind returning again and again to the young woman he had spoken with that morning, to the shape of her eyes and the quiet strength in her voice, so reminiscent of the woman he had loved and lost so many years before. He thought, too, of Margaret Coleman, and the calculating coldness he had glimpsed beneath her polished manners the previous evening. He had dealt with enough ambitious, self-interested people throughout his years of managing his family's estate to recognize the particular flavor of desperation that had flashed across her face when he first raised the possibility of Alara's true parentage. He did not doubt, even as he stood there considering the matter, that Margaret would attempt to interfere with his investigation by whatever means available to her, and he resolved, quietly but firmly, to ensure that whatever schemes she attempted would ultimately fail. That evening, Agnes returned to her small cottage on the edge of the Whitmore estate, her mind still turning over the events of the morning meeting. She had spent decades believing Isabel's story to be a private tragedy, known only to herself and a handful of others sworn to secrecy by circumstances beyond their control. Seeing Alara's face, so clearly marked with her mother's features, had reopened old wounds she thought long healed, and had rekindled a fierce protectiveness she had not felt in 25 years. She sat that night by her small fire, composing a letter in careful, deliberate handwriting, addressed to an old friend who had once served as a midwife in the county where Isabel had eventually settled. If anyone still living could confirm the precise timeline of Alara's birth, Agnes reasoned. It would be someone who had been present for the event itself. Someone whose testimony could not easily be dismissed or discredited by anyone seeking to prevent the truth from coming to light. She sealed the letter carefully and set it aside to be sent first thing the following morning, feeling, for the first time in many years, that she might finally have the opportunity to help right a wrong that had haunted her for far too long. Isabel had died before ever learning that Alden Whitmore never stopped loving her, never stopped searching, in his own quiet and constrained way, for some trace of the life they had been forced to abandon. But her daughter, Agnes thought, still had the chance to claim what her mother never could: recognition, belonging, and a place among the family that had once torn her parents apart. Whether Margaret Coleman's schemes would succeed in preventing that outcome remained to be seen, but Agnes intended to do everything within her power to ensure that the truth, however inconvenient for those who preferred it buried, would ultimately prevail. A floorboard creaked outside Alara's door in the middle of the night, and her eyes snapped open in the darkness before her mind had even fully registered the sound. She lay perfectly still, listening, her heart pounding as a second creak followed the first, closer this time, deliberate and careful in a way that no innocent footstep would be. She had grown skilled, over the years, at sensing danger in small sounds, and every instinct told her that whoever moved outside her door in the dead of night had not come to check on her well-being. She reached up slowly and pressed her hand against the locket resting on her collarbone, reassuring herself that it remained exactly where it belonged, before easing herself upright and reaching for the small candle beside her bed. The door handle turned slowly, the faint metallic click barely audible over the sound of her own racing pulse. Alara rose quickly and silently, pressing herself against the wall beside the door, rather than remaining an easy target within her bed, and watched as the door eased open just wide enough to admit a single figure carrying no candle of their own, relying instead on the faint moonlight filtering through her small window. She recognized the shape immediately. Marisol. "What are you doing?" Alara demanded, her voice cutting through the darkness sharply enough that Marisol startled visibly, nearly dropping the small knife she carried in one trembling hand. Marisol froze, caught entirely off guard, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and shame as she registered Alara standing beside the door, rather than sleeping soundly in her bed as expected. She began, then faltered, her earlier confidence entirely absent. "Answer me," Alara pressed, taking a step closer, her eyes flicking to the knife in her stepsister's hand with growing alarm. "Why are you creeping into my room in the middle of the night carrying a blade?" Marisol's composure crumbled entirely, and she sank down onto the edge of Alara's narrow bed, the knife slipping from her fingers to clatter softly against the floorboards. "Mother sent me," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said if the locket disappeared, if it could no longer be produced as evidence, the Duke's entire case would collapse. She said I only needed to cut it free while you slept, that you would never even wake, that it would solve everything." Alara stared at her stepsister in the dim moonlight, feeling a complicated tangle of anger and something almost like pity settle in her chest. "And you agreed to this?" she asked quietly. "I did not know what else to do," Marisol said, her voice cracking with an emotion Alara had rarely heard from her before, something raw and uncertain. "Everything is falling apart, Alara. Mother is desperate, and desperate people make desperate demands, and I have spent my entire life doing exactly what she asks of me without question. But standing here now, looking at you, I find I cannot do it. I cannot cut that locket from your neck like some common thief in the night." Alara studied her stepsister's face carefully, searching for any sign of deception, but found instead genuine distress, the crumbling of a confidence that had always seemed so solid and impenetrable. "Marisol," she said finally, her voice softer now, "do you truly believe I would take everything from you and your mother, given the chance? Is that truly what you fear?" "I do not know what to believe anymore," Marisol admitted. "I have spent years believing you beneath us, believing you deserved nothing better than scraps and cast-off clothing, because that is what Mother taught me to believe. But watching the Duke look at you last night, watching him speak of you with such hope in his voice, I began to wonder whether everything I believed about my own place in this world was built on nothing more than my mother's fear and ambition." Alara knelt down slowly, retrieving the small knife from the floor and setting it carefully on the bedside table, well out of reach of either of them. "Whatever happens with the Duke's investigation," she said carefully, "I promise you this. I have no interest in destroying you or your mother out of spite. If I am truly his daughter, if this claim proves true, I intend to seek only what is rightfully mine, nothing more. I do not wish to see you or your mother left with nothing." Marisol looked up at her with an expression of genuine surprise. "Why would you extend such mercy?" she asked. "After everything we have done to you." "Because I remember what it felt like to be shown no mercy at all," Ilara said simply. "And I do not wish to become the very thing I have spent 6 years enduring." The two young women sat in silence for a long moment, the tension between them slowly easing into something more fragile, but perhaps more honest than anything that had existed between them in years. Finally, Marisol rose from the bed, retrieving nothing, taking with her only the weight of a failed mission and a growing uncertainty about everything she had once believed to be true. "I will tell Mother I could not find a way to accomplish it without waking you," she said quietly, pausing at the door. "I will not tell her that I chose not to try." "Thank you," Ilara said, and meant it. The following morning, word arrived from the Whitmore estate that Mr. Hartley's investigation had already yielded significant progress. A carriage collected Ilara shortly after breakfast, and she arrived to find the Duke waiting in his study once more, this time accompanied not only by Agnes, but by Mr. Hartley himself, along with a stack of documents spread carefully across the wide desk. "We have found something quite significant," the Duke said as Ilara entered, his expression carrying a barely contained excitement that had replaced much of the previous day's cautious uncertainty. "A church registry from the parish nearest to your father's estate, recording the marriage of Edmund Grant to a woman named Isabel, arriving in the county as a widow, though we now believe that story to have been a fabrication designed to protect her from further pursuit. The marriage took place scarcely 2 months after she disappeared from this estate." "And the birth record?" Ilara asked, her own heart beginning to race with anticipation. Mr. Hartley stepped forward, presenting a second document with careful precision. "Recorded 7 months after the marriage," he said, "which, given the customary discretion applied to such matters in official records, aligns precisely with a child conceived before the marriage itself, exactly as we would expect if you were indeed conceived during Isabel's relationship with His Grace, prior to her forced departure from this county." Ilara studied the documents carefully, her own name recorded there in faded ink, alongside her mother's, the timeline exactly as the Duke had suspected. Beside her, Agnes produced a folded letter of her own, received just that morning, from her old friend the midwife, now elderly but still sharp of memory, confirming that Isabel had specifically requested her presence for the birth, and had wept, both from pain and from some deeper sorrow the midwife had never fully understood at the time, repeating a single name throughout her labor that the midwife had never forgotten in all the years since. "Alden," Agnes read quietly from the letter. She said the name Alden over and over throughout the birth of her daughter. The Duke's composure broke entirely at these words, and he turned away from the desk for a long moment, his shoulders shaking with an emotion he could no longer contain. When he finally turned back to face Ilara, his eyes were wet with tears he made no effort to hide. "I have waited 25 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion, for even the smallest confirmation that Isabel carried some piece of our love forward into the world after I lost her. And now I find, not merely a piece, but an entire daughter, grown into a woman of such evident strength and grace, that I can scarcely believe my own good fortune in finding her." Ilara felt tears of her own gathering, the weight of years spent believing herself unwanted, overlooked, and unloved, finally beginning to lift under the growing certainty of this new truth. "Then it is confirmed," she asked softly. "I am truly your daughter." "As confirmed as any evidence could make it," Mr. Hartley said, gathering the documents carefully. "Church records, birth timelines, witness testimony regarding your mother's final words during labor, all align precisely with the account His Grace has shared. I would stake my professional reputation on the conclusion that you are indeed the daughter of Alden Whitmore and Isabel Grant." The Duke crossed the room in a few quick strides and, without hesitation, drew Ilara into an embrace, the formal boundaries of their earlier meetings entirely forgotten in the overwhelming relief and joy of the moment. "My daughter," he murmured against her hair. "My beautiful, brave daughter. I only wish your mother had lived long enough to see this day." Ilara returned the embrace, feeling, for the first time, and longer than she could remember, the particular warmth of belonging fully and completely to someone who wanted her, not for what use she could provide, but simply because she existed. But even as she allowed herself this moment of joy, a small part of her mind remained wary, aware that Margaret would not accept this confirmed truth without one final, desperate attempt to prevent it from reshaping the world as she knew it. Margaret's fury upon learning of Marisol's failed attempt was immediate and volcanic, though she forced herself to contain it behind closed doors, unwilling to let the household staff witness the full extent of her panic. "You had one simple task," she hissed at her daughter that evening, pacing the length of the drawing room with quick, agitated steps. "One locket, one small piece of silver standing between us and ruin, and you could not even manage that." "I could not do it, Mother," Marisol said, her voice steadier than it had been in days, a new resolve settling into her features that Margaret did not recognize. "I will not do it. Whatever happens now, I will not become a thief in the night to preserve a lie." Margaret rounded on her daughter with an expression of pure disbelief. "Have you lost all sense?" she demanded. "Do you understand what we stand to lose?" "I understand precisely what we stand to lose," Marisol replied, meeting her mother's furious gaze without flinching for the first time in her life. "And I have begun to wonder whether we ever deserved to keep it in the first place." Margaret stared at her daughter for a long moment, searching for some way to reassert her authority, before turning away with a frustrated exhale and retreating to her own private study, where she began composing letters late into the night, reaching out to distant relatives and old acquaintances with legal connections, searching desperately for any avenue that might yet allow her to salvage the situation. By the following week, word of the Duke's investigation had spread through the county, despite his best efforts at discretion, whispered from household to household, embellished with each retelling, until the story took on an almost mythical quality among the local gentry. A stepdaughter, reduced to servitude, discovered to be the long-lost child of a duke, her mother's tragic love story, finally brought to light after 25 years of silence. It was, many agreed, precisely the sort of tale that made for irresistible gossip at every social gathering across the region. Margaret, desperate to control the narrative before it could fully escape her grasp, made a final, calculated decision. She would confront the Duke directly, armed with whatever legal arguments Mr. Fenwick could provide, and attempt to negotiate a settlement that would preserve at least a portion of her family's standing, even if she could no longer prevent Ilara's parentage from becoming publicly known. She arrived at the Whitmore estate unannounced on a gray afternoon, requesting an audience with the Duke with a confidence she did not entirely feel, and was surprised to find herself granted entry almost immediately, shown into the same study where Ilara had first learned the truth of her heritage days earlier. "Your Grace," Margaret began, settling into the offered chair with careful composure, "I understand that recent discoveries have placed my family in a rather delicate position. I have come today hoping we might discuss a resolution that serves everyone's interests, rather than allowing this matter to descend into public scandal and legal conflict." The Duke regarded her with the same cool authority he had shown at the wedding, entirely unmoved by her carefully rehearsed opening. "What resolution did you have in mind?" he asked evenly. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "I have managed Edmund's estate faithfully since his passing," she said. "I have raised Ilara alongside my own daughter, provided for her needs, given her shelter and structure during difficult years. Surely some acknowledgement of that sacrifice would be appropriate, should Ilara's claim to your family prove successful. Perhaps a modest settlement, sufficient to secure my daughter's future, in exchange for my full cooperation and support of Ilara's new position." The Duke's expression hardened slightly at her words. "I have reviewed considerable documentation regarding Edmund Grant's estate in recent days," he said, his voice carrying a warning edge that made Margaret's carefully maintained composure falter slightly. "Documentation that suggests certain financial arrangements were altered following his death. Arrangements that appear to have significantly benefited you and your daughter, at the expense of the inheritance rightfully belonging to Ilara, as Edmund's only biological child." Margaret's face paled, though she attempted to recover quickly. "I do not know what you are suggesting, Your Grace," she said, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I am suggesting," the Duke continued, "that my legal advisor has uncovered evidence of financial mismanagement, potentially fraudulent alteration of inheritance documents following Edmund's death, all designed to strip Alara of resources that were legally hers by birthright. I have not yet decided how aggressively to pursue this matter, but I would advise you to consider very carefully whether continuing to negotiate from a position of perceived strength serves you well, given what has already come to light. Margaret sat frozen in her chair, the full weight of her exposure settling over her with crushing clarity. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that her careful manipulation of Edmund's estate documents in the months following his death had been thorough enough to withstand scrutiny. She had not anticipated the resources and determination a duke could bring to bear once his own interests aligned with uncovering the truth. "Your Grace," she said finally, her voice small in a way it had never been before, "whatever mistakes I may have made in managing the estate, I ask you to consider Marisol in all of this. She is innocent of any wrongdoing, a young woman with her entire future still ahead of her. Do not let my failures determine her fate." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something almost like pity flickering briefly across his stern features. "I have no wish to see an innocent young woman suffer for her mother's choices," he said finally. "But I must tell you honestly, Margaret, that the path forward from here depends entirely on your willingness to cooperate fully and honestly with the ongoing investigation. Continued attempts at manipulation or concealment will only worsen your position, both legally and socially. Honesty, at this point, remains your only viable option." Margaret left the Whitmore estate that afternoon with none of the confidence she had carried upon arrival, her mind churning through the wreckage of schemes that had crumbled one by one over the past several days. She understood, with growing dread, that the careful facade she had constructed over 6 years, the appearance of a respectable widow managing her late husband's estate responsibly, stood on the verge of complete collapse, and that no amount of desperate maneuvering remained available to prevent it. That evening, she gathered Marisol into her study, her earlier fury replaced by something closer to exhausted resignation. "It is over," she admitted quietly, staring into the cold fireplace rather than meeting her daughter's eyes. "Whatever I have built these past years, whatever protection I believed I had secured for us, it is unraveling faster than I can manage. The Duke knows about the estate documents. He knows about the inheritance I redirected after your father's death." Marisol sat quietly for a long moment, processing this admission. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "I do not know," Margaret said, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, her voice carried genuine uncertainty, rather than calculated control. "I suppose we shall discover, quite soon, exactly what mercy Alara Grant is willing to extend to those who showed her so little of it themselves." 3 weeks later, the great hall of the Whitmore estate filled once more with guests, though this gathering carried none of the celebratory abandon of the wedding that had first brought Alara and the Duke together. This was a more formal occasion, called at the Duke's request to settle the matter of Alara's parentage publicly and definitively, before the assembled representatives of the county's most influential families, silencing any lingering whispers or doubts that might otherwise follow her for years to come. Alara stood near the front of the hall, dressed now in a gown of deep green silk that the Duke had insisted on providing, the fabric far finer than anything she had worn in her entire life, though she found herself thinking, even now, of the torn gray dress she had worn to the wedding weeks earlier, and the strange journey that single evening had set into motion. The locket rested at her throat as always, though now it caught the light not as a hidden secret but as a symbol proudly displayed for all to see. Mr. Hartley stood beside a long table at the front of the hall, documents arranged carefully before him, prepared to present the full findings of his investigation to the assembled crowd. The Duke stood near his daughter, his bearing carrying a quiet pride that had replaced the guarded formality he once wore like armor, and across the hall, Margaret and Marisol sat together, their postures rigid, with the particular tension of those awaiting judgment they could no longer avoid. "Friends and neighbors," the Duke began, his voice carrying easily across the hushed hall. "I have called you here today because rumors and speculation have circulated through this county for weeks now, regarding a matter of great personal significance to my family. Rather than allow such speculation to continue unchecked, I have chosen to present the full truth before you all, so that no doubt or misunderstanding may linger afterward." He gestured toward Mr. Hartley, who stepped forward and began methodically presenting the evidence his investigation had uncovered. The church registry recording Isabel's marriage to Edmund Grant, the birth record establishing Alara's precise date of birth, The sworn testimony of the midwife, who had attended Isabel during labor, and Agnes's own account of Isabel's forced departure from the Whitmore estate 25 years earlier. Each piece of evidence was presented with careful precision, building a case so thorough that even the most skeptical members of the assembled crowd found themselves nodding along in growing acceptance. "I therefore declare, formally and publicly," the Duke said once Mr. Hartley had finished, "that Alara Grant is my daughter, born of my love for Isabel Grant, before circumstances beyond either of our control forced us apart. I acknowledge her fully, before all of you, as my rightful heir, and I intend to see her recognized with every honor and privilege that recognition entails." A murmur swept through the crowd, not of shock, for the rumors had already prepared most of them for this announcement, but of genuine emotion, many faces softening with sympathy for the long-separated lovers, and the daughter who had grown up unaware of her true heritage. But the Duke was not finished. "There remains a second matter requiring resolution before this gathering concludes," he continued, his tone shifting to something harder, more formal. "My legal advisor has also uncovered evidence of significant financial mismanagement concerning the estate left behind by Edmund Grant, evidence suggesting that inheritance rightfully belonging to Alara was deliberately redirected in the years following her father's death." All eyes turned toward Margaret, whose face had gone entirely pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Mr. Hartley presented a final set of documents, comparing original estate records against those Margaret had filed following Edmund's death. The discrepancies laid bare for the assembled crowd to see clearly. Sums of money quietly diverted, property transferred under circumstances that bore little resemblance to legitimate inheritance practices. "Margaret Coleman," the Duke said, his voice carrying the weight of formal accusation now, "you have systematically deprived your stepdaughter of resources that were legally hers, while subjecting her to years of mistreatment within a household she should have rightfully commanded as its true heir. I leave it to Alara herself to determine what consequences, if any, she wishes to pursue regarding these findings." Every eye in the hall turned toward Alara, waiting to see how she would respond to this moment of complete vindication, this opportunity to exact whatever punishment she deemed appropriate for 6 years of cruelty and manipulation. She rose slowly from her seat, walking toward the center of the hall, where Margaret sat frozen with dread, Marisol beside her, both women awaiting judgment, with expressions that carried more fear than either had shown in the entire unfolding drama. Alara studied them both for a long moment before speaking, her voice steady and clear enough to carry across the silent hall. "I have thought carefully about this moment," she said, "about what justice might look like for the years of cruelty I endured within my own home. I could demand that every legal consequence be pursued to its fullest extent. I could see Margaret stripped entirely of whatever remains of her position and standing, cast out with nothing, exactly as she once threatened to do to me." She paused, watching Margaret's face carefully, seeing the raw fear there, the desperate hope for mercy that neither woman quite dared to voice aloud. "But I find," Alara continued, "that I have no wish to become the very cruelty I have spent years enduring. I ask, instead, that Margaret return the inheritance rightfully belonging to me, in full, under whatever legal process His Grace's advisor deems appropriate. Beyond that, I ask for nothing further. She and Marisol may retain the modest portion of the estate that was always rightfully theirs, and I ask only that we part ways, from this day forward, without further conflict or bitterness." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd at this unexpected mercy, several guests exchanging glances of quiet admiration for the composure and grace Alara displayed in a moment when many would have chosen vengeance instead. Margaret stared at her stepdaughter with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and shame, understanding perhaps for the first time the full measure of the young woman she had spent years underestimating. "Alara," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "why would you extend such mercy, after everything?" "Because cruelty accomplishes nothing beyond perpetuating more cruelty," Alara said simply. "I would rather begin this new chapter of my life with grace than with bitterness, regardless of what you may or may not deserve." Marisol, seated beside her mother, felt tears gathering in her eyes, the weight of shame and gratitude mingling together in a way she had never experienced before. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words felt inadequate against the enormity of what Alara had just offered them both. The Duke, watching this exchange with quiet pride, stepped forward to stand beside his daughter once more, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You have shown more wisdom in this single moment," he said softly, meant only for her ears, "than many rulers manage across an entire lifetime of governance. Your mother would have been immeasurably proud of the woman you have become." Alara felt tears of her own gathering as she looked up at her father, this man she had known for scarcely a month yet, who had already come to feel like the missing piece of a puzzle she had spent her entire life trying to complete. As the assembled crowd began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves about the remarkable turn of events they had just witnessed, Alara allowed herself, for the first time since that fateful night at the wedding, to simply breathe, to feel the weight of 6 years of servitude finally lifting from her shoulders, replaced by the quiet, steady promise of a future she had never dared to imagine possible. Spring arrived early that year, or perhaps it only seemed that way to Alara, who found herself noticing the world around her with fresh eyes, in the months following the public gathering that had finally settled her true identity, before all the county to see. The Whitmore estate, once a place she had only glimpsed from the edges of a crowded ballroom, had slowly become something closer to home, though she still found herself occasionally startled by the ease with which servants now addressed her as Lady Alara, a title she had never expected to carry. Her father, as she had begun calling him with growing comfort, insisted on formally presenting her to society over the following weeks, a series of smaller gatherings designed to introduce her properly to the families and connections that would now shape her future. She approached each occasion with the same quiet composure that had carried her through years of hardship, though now that composure was met with genuine warmth rather than the careful cruelty she had grown accustomed to enduring. Agnes had become a frequent presence at the estate as well, sharing stories of Isabel's youth that filled in the missing pieces of a mother Alara had never truly known. She learned of her mother's love of wildflowers, her habit of humming softly while she worked, her particular laugh that Agnes described as bright and unrestrained, entirely unlike the careful, guarded expressions Alara had grown accustomed to wearing during her years under Margaret's roof. Slowly, piece by piece, Alara began to reconstruct a portrait of the woman whose locket she had worn every day of her life, without ever understanding its true significance. "I wish I could have known her properly," Alara admitted to her father one evening, the two of them sitting together in his study, as the last light of day faded beyond the tall windows. "I have only fragments, impressions from early childhood that feel more like dreams than memories." "She would have been so proud of you," the Duke said gently, the pain of losing Isabel still present in his voice, though softened now by the joy of having found their daughter in her place. "I see so much of her in you, Alara. Her strength, her quiet dignity, her refusal to let cruelty diminish her spirit. I only regret that circumstances kept us apart for so long that I never had the chance to raise you myself, to protect you from the years of hardship you endured before I even knew you existed." "You found me in the end," Alara said softly. "That is more than many daughters ever receive." As for Margaret and Marisol, true to Alara's word, they had been permitted to retain a modest portion of the estate, sufficient to maintain a comfortable, if considerably reduced, standard of living. Margaret had retreated largely from public society, her earlier ambitions and schemes replaced by a quieter, more chastened existence, though whether true remorse had taken root in her heart remained uncertain even to those who observed her closely. Marisol, however, had begun visiting Alara occasionally, tentative at first, then with growing warmth, the two young women slowly building something that resembled, if not quite friendship, at least a fragile mutual respect neither had thought possible before. "I never properly apologized," Marisol said during one such visit, the two of them walking together through the gardens behind the Whitmore estate on a warm afternoon. "For all the years of cruelty, for believing myself entitled to treat you as though you mattered less than the rest of us." "You do not need to apologize further," Alara said, though she appreciated the gesture nonetheless. "We were both shaped by circumstances neither of us chose. I choose, now, to focus on who we might become going forward, rather than dwelling on who we once were." Marisol smiled at this, a genuine expression entirely unlike the careless, cruel laughter Alara remembered from years past. "I am glad," she said, "that the locket found its way to the right person after all. I confess I never understood, back when Mother tried to take it from you all those years ago, why you fought so fiercely to keep it. I understand now." Alara touched the locket gently, the familiar weight of it resting against her collarbone exactly as it had for so many years, though its meaning had transformed entirely since that fateful night at the wedding. "It was the last piece of my mother I had left," she said. "I never imagined it would become the key to finding my father as well." As summer approached, the Duke arranged for Alara's formal introduction into society, to culminate in a grand celebration of her own, held in the very hall where she had once served drinks to guests who barely acknowledged her existence. This time, she stood at the center of the celebration, rather than at its edges, dressed in a gown of her own choosing, the locket displayed proudly, rather than hidden beneath a worn collar, surrounded by guests who greeted her not with careless dismissal, but with genuine warmth and respect. She danced that evening with her father, the two of them moving slowly across the same marble floor where she had once knelt to gather shattered glass, while guests laughed at her expense. The chandeliers above cast the same golden light they always had, but everything else, she realized, had changed entirely, transformed by the courage it had taken to walk into that ballroom in a torn gray dress, refusing to let cruelty define her worth. "I am so proud of you," her father murmured as they danced, his eyes bright with emotion he no longer felt any need to hide. "Your mother would be proud as well, wherever she watches over us now." Alara smiled, feeling the warmth of belonging settle fully into her heart for the first time in longer than she could remember. "I like to think she already knows," she said softly, "that somehow, she has been watching this whole time, waiting for the day her daughter would finally find her way home." As the music swelled around them, and the candlelight flickered warmly across the crowded hall, Alara allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to embrace the life that had unfolded from a single glint of silver at her throat. A small locket that had carried her mother's love across 25 years, and had finally, against every possible obstacle, brought a broken family back together. The girl in the tattered dress had become the daughter of a duke, but more importantly, she had remained, through every trial and hardship, exactly who she had always been: strong, gracious, and unwilling to let cruelty win. And in the end, that steady, unwavering strength had proven more powerful than any title or inheritance ever could.